All right, we've now arrived at the transmitter. So I'm going to assume that we created our repository and we used Jetty Studio and the Lua App Manager to bring our panels down that include the example we just did, painting gauges onto the Jet Central panel. So let's go into, by the way, just for a second, let's pause here. You see on soft key number 1 here, that help logo. A lot of times in the Jetty examples, you'll see that up here in the upper right. That appears to be something, placing the help question mark up here in the upper right is something that Jetty is doing internally. There's not an easy way that I've discovered yet to do that as an end user. I put it here on soft key number 1, and if you press it, it's going to give you help that goes along with each of the screens. Now, many of the screens I'm using all the soft keys already, so I put this here on soft key 1 just to let you know that help's available. But the other thing you've probably noticed on your Jetty is that if you hit the menu button, you'll get a help screen. And so what I've done is on all my other screens, if you don't see this help on soft key 1, you can hit the menu button and get a quick help screen. Okay, so now let's go into panels. And let's go down and create a new panel. And let's read in Jet Central. And it comes with its background, so we don't need to add a background. Let's just make sure that we set that to selected and home. And then we'll go up here to the top. And you'll see, oh, I've already, from when I was working before, left the line 1 and line 2 on there. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. Now, I don't know if you can see it very well on the video, but there's a little dash, dash, dash at the center of each of these gauges. And since I didn't give them labels, the app has labeled them gauge 1, gauge 2, gauge 3, and gauge 4 that reflects the order in which I created them on the website. So what we're going to do is we're going to connect telemetry sensors to these. So if I go into Applications, Instrument Panel, Inputs, gauge 1 is my RPM gauge, so I'll take the sensor, I'll go to my tachometer RPM, and 150 is what I already had set for the sensor emulator, so that looks good. So let's go back up to the top, and you'll see that on slider number 2, I've got gauge 1, and it's animating from 0 to 150. You can see right in the center that default location for the digital value. And of course, that's not where we want that. So let's go down to Instrument Panel, Edit Panel. And let's first start by, and by the way, we can adjust the center position of the virtual gauge in X and Y if we want to bump it up or down by a few pixels, which I don't think we have to do because we did a good job centering it on the website. But let's go to label, which is this gauge 1. And we really don't need that. So let's go to font, and let's change that to a font of none, which takes it away. Then let's go to value, and then we'll edit the y coordinate of value, and this would be done with the 3D wheel on the transmitter, but we're going to do it here with the buttons on the emulator. And then let's edit the font of that to be quite a bit bigger, something like that. I think this font size is too big, so we'll go with the biggest font size that fits. And you can see what Jet Central did by opening up their arc like this. It gives you room for that digital value. Okay, so we can say OK, and then next we'll turn our attention to gauge 2, which is the fuel. So we'll go to Inputs, gauge 2, and we'll set that to the fuel percentage, and that's a 0 to 100%, so that's already the correct units. We'll go up to the top and slider number 1, and you see we're animating now the fuel gauge, and then we'll go into Applications, Instrument Panel, Edit Panel, and we'll select this gauge, and then we'll look at the label and font, and we'll erase that, and then we'll go back to value and Y, and we'll move that down to center it, and we'll go to font, and we'll increase the font size, and then maybe we'll go back and just tweak the Y location a little bit to kind of center that number. And I think the idea here would be to use the biggest number you can use, because you want to be able to glance at it. You're obviously not going to be staring at this panel while you're flying, but fuel is so critical, in a turbine model, that you want that number to be big enough that if you just glance at the panel, that you can read. And that's why Jet Central made this the largest gauge and put it right in the center. Okay, and so that's now that gauge done. And I would do exactly the same thing. Go back up top. I would do exactly the same thing for the EGT and the turbine battery in gauge 3 and gauge 4. You see I have line 1 and line 2 if I want to go into those. And I want to go into inputs. That's raw text. And I could assign a sensor to that if I wanted to. And let's see, I could have an input source of sensor. I could have maybe some parameter, for example, a lot of turbine manufacturers publish a graph of thrust versus RPM. And what I've done on my turbines is I've got a modified version of the CTU app because I use the CTU on some of my systems. And I basically took the numbers off the manufacturer's RPM versus thrust, and I played a little bit with polynomial fitting. And I found that most of them fit nicely to a cubic polynomial, and I hard coded into the CTU app, a custom version I have for myself, that curve of thrust versus RPM, so that I can read out the thrust. And you could do the same thing here, except we have the facility. You wouldn't have to hard code it. You could do it right in Lua. So you could create a Lua variable for the RPM of the engine. Then you could create a second Lua variable that was, instead of being assigned to a sensor, assigned to a Lua expression. Create that cubic polynomial expression based on the RPM variable, and actually in one of these two boxes that says line 1 and line 2, you could display the actual thrust that the turbine is producing at that RPM. So those are some ideas of things you could do. But again, this is a case where people that invest tons of time in custom drawn panels, and they're going to be pretty. I mean, we can make some very pretty panels with our drag and drop, but when you have the complete control of these things as artistic elements, you can see Jet Central's done such a nice job with the shading and making the gauges have a real three-dimensional feel. I mean, it's really quite a beautiful panel. And of course, we're blowing it up here to a bigger size than it's meant to be viewed at. But in the actual transmitter context, it's just beautiful. But it provides just such a nice opportunity to thank Jet Central for doing such a good job and to acknowledge them for that. But it also gives us a nice example to see how you could take any panel that someone else might draw or you yourself might draw and then animate